Welcome to the Evolving Past Alzheimer's podcast, where we are focused on bringing you information to help prevent and reverse brain diseases like Alzheimer's and other dementias. I'm Dr. Nate Bergman, a functional medicine physician in Cleveland, Ohio, and your host on this journey. So, whether you're a baby boomer who's worried that your brain wiring just isn't working like it once was, or you have loved ones with the disease, or you yourself have already been diagnosed and are wondering, what do I do now? You'll want to listen to this podcast. Each episode, we introduce you to the top doers and thinkers that are revisioning Alzheimer's and dementia. If you have questions or comments or just want to connect, please check us out on our Facebook page, or if you're old-fashioned like me, Google Evolving Past Alzheimer's Podcast, and you'll find us that way. So here we go. Let's get better. Welcome back to the show. We are honored to have Katy Bowman with us today. Katy is part biomechanist, part science communicator, and full-time mover. Katy Bowman has educated hundreds of thousands of people on the role movement plays in the body and in the world. She is a prolific author of many books and other media outlets. You can find her all over the internet. She directs the Nutritious Movement Center in the Pacific Northwest and travels around the world teaching nutritious movement. Welcome, Katy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, that's great. First of all, I love the name Nutritious Movement. That struck me right away when I first heard about you. What's your background and how'd you come up with that name?
Well, I'm a biomechanist, and so that's a science that you don't hear that much about. It's the laws of basically Newtonian physics, mechanics, applied to living systems. And in this case, I mostly work with the human body. I'm mostly interested in the mechanics of disease. And I guess you could also say the mechanics of health or wellness.
Sure.
And the name came after I've been doing this for a long time, almost 20 years. And I've had lots of names kind of for what I do along the way. But mechano-transduction is an idea that your cells are influenced by the mechanical environment as well. So not only the genome, but it would also be called the mechanome. And when that understanding became more written about and there was more research on it, then it started to influence my work more. So I started to I was trained allopathically, and this idea of exercise, that we'll talk about, I'm sure, at great length. But exercise doesn't have very much nuance because it's a very young science, maybe only 40 or 50 years old, maybe 60, maybe. And so there's a lot of nuance. And so I was really trying to explain sort of the evolution of the ideas that are within exercise science, likening them to nutrition, where it took a very long time, hundreds of years, to really parse out these things called nutrients. And nutrients are always recognized in hindsight by the disease profiles that would go away when you introduced particular nutrients. And for a long time, the debates, if you look back in the literature, you can read, it kind of reads like a crazy Facebook discussion sometimes, the comments back and forth on the research during the day of, the idea of macronutrients and micronutrients, things that we take for granted now as just everyone knows. Everyone in elementary school is exposed to these ideas. They were very radical during a period of time when not starving was really like the height of sophistication for pockets of people, and like the idea that there would be ratios of proteins and fats, and that there were even different types of fats. These things took microscopes to be able to further delineate.
Yeah, characterize.
Yeah, it just took a long time to really break down that human beings really, their behavior, their physiology is really dependent on a very wide spectrum. And so of inputs, in this case, chemical compounds. But we are on the same trajectory with movement, that right now it's so easy to say just move more. But if you went to a nutritionist and they said just eat more, you would, because of your exposure to a more robust science, go, well, I know that eating more isn't necessarily what I need, that there is actual specific compounds that I need. And I believe that we're on the same course with movement. And we already know that you go to physiotherapy and you don't just move more, you get, a specific angle of movement to coax, a certain muscle over here and a muscle over there to work and get stronger, and that there are different physiological outcomes when you do that on a whole body level. But there's also cellular differences. So kind of really are trying to bring out this idea of that we are talking with movement going to be down to the nitty gritty, I believe, someday, as close as we are to nutrition, meaning that there's going to be movement macronutrients and micronutrients, and that we'll understand that there are many diseases that don't relate necessarily to, the mouth and the digestive parts of your body, that are influenced by the movement environment that we partake in. And so, on one hand, it's kind of like an analogy, trying to tie it to nutrition. But on the other hand, on a more sophisticated argument level, it's actually quite literal. I believe that we will find that there are specific bends to cells or movement of individual cells in the end that we're going to be needing or recognizing the need for, and that we'll identify someday specific movements as nutrients.
Wow, that is so much more sophisticated of an answer than I just love the name. I was really just thought, wow, that's such a yummy name,
It's fun, but there's a reason behind it.
Now I totally understand. And knowing some of what you do, like I mentioned, my wife has been following you for a long time, and it has, over the last couple of years, kind of had me read some of your stuff and listen and watch others, because it's highly practical. It's so clever and creative, and I would say unusual at this point. And you keep saying, Katy, like movement as opposed to exercise. And you mentioned that before. Why to say movement instead of calling it what most people call it, which is exercise? Think about beneficial types of movement. We call that exercise, but you don't call it that. You call it movement.
Well, I do that because I think that we've lost sight of really the clinical definitions of all these things. And I think this is one of the reasons we're not making as much headway into various ailments as they relate to movement. So exercise is actually a subcategory of movement. It's a clinical phenomenon. It's not a natural phenomenon. So the definition clinically of exercise is movement that is done usually for a specified period of time. It has a mode, which means you've chosen the thing that you're going to do. So cycling is a mode, walking is a mode, running is a mode, lifting weights would be a mode, stretching is a mode. It's that you've picked the activity type, you've defined it, and you've given it a boundary, either in time or repetitions or distance. So it's the way currently movement is analyzed, is we're usually looking at this phenomenon of exercise. Exercise itself is in a category of physical activity, which is any caloric expenditure. It's an event that expends kcals or calories based on the movement of your musculoskeletal system. And it's done usually in repetition so that you can see a caloric deficit accumulate. So that's what physical activity is. And physical activity could also be raking your leaves or doing chores. And so in research, you'll see physical activity with a subcategory of exercise, but it really has, because movement is such a young science, the bulk of our understanding of movement was really heavily biased towards our understanding of it 30 years ago, which was it's something that you do to burn calories. That movement was really understood to kind of be the balance of eating, full stop. And so you can still see that kind of cultural bias left over in the way that we talk about it, which is it's something that you do to increase physical fitness. But it always, again, relates back to caloric expenditure, even though now, 40 years later, so much more is known about the benefits of the protective nature of movement, but the earlier definitions don't reflect that. So movement is actually the largest category around physical activity. I always draw a Venn diagram when I explain this. So I have like a huge bubble that is movement, and inside of that bubble is physical activity. And then inside of the physical activity bubble is something even smaller, which is exercise. So when we talk about exercise, as far as the phenomenon of human movement goes, it's a very, very small percentage, both in the time that you have available to do it. And exercise, another clinical hallmark I forgot to mention, is it's usually something that's done with the intent to improve a physical fitness variable versus physical activity, which is something that you would do to address something that you need in your life. For example, raking your leaves is it gets something else done besides only improving your physical fitness. So that's again, a hallmark difference between the two. So you can have exercise and non-exercise physical activity. And so intent has a lot to do with it. So riding your bike for 20 minutes, for your cardiovascular health or for your brain health or, just to feel better in general, that would be exercise. But if that exact same bike ride is just you getting to work and that's your mode of transportation, then it moves outside of the exercise category. Gets a little theoretical at some point, but I do think that those delineations are going to turn out to be important as we look at things like the adherence to exercise prescriptions. And sometimes maybe we don't need people to exercise, but we do need them to move, and then to recognize the cultural nature of exercise as something requiring free time and extra money and things that not everyone has access to, including greater at-risk populations for sedentarism. And so I speak that way because I believe, just like in any category of science, that delineation is key. And once you have the differences, that's how you keep moving in understanding application, and further delineation is by making sure that those definitions are upheld.
Yeah, no, listening to you describe this in these words, and I haven't ever heard you describe it in these words, really makes me think about general nutrition, like you're talking about, sort of a whole foods nutrition versus breaking things down into micronutrients only and macronutrients only. You're taking movement way beyond basic exercise, sort of, Newtonian energy, thermodynamics, things like that, and extending it way into sort of, well, let's talk about function and what are we trying to do in the world, as opposed to I'm trying to increase my beats per minute of my heart rate, or I'm trying to increase some blood pressure parameter. You're much more, it sounds like it's sort of a much larger, you call it practical, you call it functional, probably a lot of different ways to classify it. Much more functional, practical goal, it seems, of real life.
Well, in the end, sometimes clinicians and researchers and scientists live, our reality can be the clinic, and we read data in clinical terms. We understand things in research terms, but people aren't living experiments in the way that we do them to figure out how nature works. They're living their lives. And so they're trying to take data about how nature works and put it into everyday life. And so I think the delineation is important because in the end, the person is there's not very many people that if you ask won't note that trying to move more is their end goal. And I think that sometimes the tendency is to make everything super simple, just exercise 30 minutes a day. It can't get any easier than that. But I think sometimes the technicality can, in the end, help people see where movement fits in. So I'm also very interested in movement ecology, which is like any science. You start dialing it up a little bit to see the interrelatedness to, why do we have such a sedentary culture? It's not only what makes movement work, it's how does sedentarism work? How does a species that requires movement for basic physiological function suddenly stop doing it in an unprecedented way? And then what are the ailments that are associated with this particular culture compared to other cross-cultural data? I'm interested in very much a very, very large picture. And at the same time, I'm interested in it on a very, very small level too. But then I recognize, I am just a human being, trying to live my job and my work, but also be with my family. And I recognize this tremendous capacity for movement and the protective nature of movement. So I want to know how to fit movement into my life in an abundant but practical way. So of course, a lot of this is also just driven out of pure selfish need. I need to figure out how to do it, and I share my findings with others.
So kind of on a practical level, you just fairly recently published a book called Dynamic Aging, which you have, many other books, and I read that, and you mention how your book is sort of to follow up with this idea that you just mentioned on cultural norms, and how does a species that's so based on natural, as a need, as a survival instinct and need, move so quickly into sort of sedentarism. And I am curious, what was the inspiration or the inkling to write this particular book for this particular population, a book on aging? Certainly it's timely, But in terms of everything that you've mentioned in terms of sedentarism and cultural norms and sort of stereotypes informing our sense of what it's like to move and feel like when we age, where did this sort of inspiration to write this book come from?
Well, I've worked with, thousands of people, and I started working in different ways. I used to have a small center and then a medium-sized center and then a very large center. And the people who are drawn to movement as a therapy are usually doing so at the point in which they have already are expressing some sort of injury or issue. And so they tend to already be an older category. And every person, who comes in at 60 said, I wish I would have known this when I was 20. And I was like, well, I tell 20-year-olds all day long, and it doesn't matter in the same way when you're 20, because there are just certain things that you have to learn on your own.
Yeah.
So I ended up working with, over 10 years, this group of people that came in at 50 and 60 and 70. So I had this group of people that had been moving in a particular way for a longer period of time.
These are your co-authors you're talking about, the Joan and Joyce and Laura and Sean?
Yeah, the co-authors are in this larger group of, a few hundred people that had been with me. I've just picked them because they are just exceptional and were interested in writing it and had really wanted to become movement teachers for this group. They all started when they were in their late 60s and early 70s. And then by the time we got to writing the book, which was 10 years later, they're all septuagenarians, and we had 2 octogenarians now. So 2 of them, one's 81 and one's 80, I believe now, or will be 80 in March. So I worked a lot with this group of people who were, I don't know what you would want to call them. I don't think that they call themselves goldeners, but they're people, over 60. And the narrative that so many people come with, would often be, like my right knee, I'm having this age-related issue. I have this thing in my right knee, and their story was always that it was age-related. And I was like, well, how old is your other knee that's not bothering you? Just like trying to get to some of the logic that is cultural. It's not logic. It's just kind of a cultural narrative around like, these are the inevitable declines. And to really, again, I'm a big delineator. It's like, well, it's very hard to delineate between age and length of habit. So anytime you read any literature, you really have to keep in mind that those two things are different. And the more cross-cultural data that you look at, especially when you look at cultures that are not sedentary and haven't been sedentary, all 50 or 60 or 70 years, you can see that there is definitely a range of capabilities where people who are physically robust aren't necessarily outliers. It takes a lot in movement-based cultures, and that movement is what trains you to continue to move. And so they were getting better on paper. They were getting younger kind of on paper, and they were becoming more physically robust over 10 years versus what you would expect to see, which would be the opposite, like a slow decline. But what I am trying to really show is when you are sedentary for your entire life, and again, mathematically, it's key to point out that even people who exercise daily are mathematically still sedentary. So that's kind of calling on other literature, kind of where the sitting is the new smoking is the pop headline over that data, where we're looking at people who are exercising daily. It's really not offsetting 8 to 12 hours of sitting all of the other time. That movement can be better distributed. It can not only be more, it can be increased in terms of frequency and distributed well throughout the day to break up this repetitive geometry that we're adapting to. And so,
can I ask a clarification on that?
Sure.
So, are you advocating, just to use this maybe an overly simplistic example to make a point here? People have to sit at desks. You're saying, well, people should stand up every 15 minutes. People should get a standing desk. Are you advocating for sort of simple solutions like that? Or are you talking more on a sort of a societal level? Like this is a population level problem that we have to have a much more robust and sophisticated solution. And perhaps, maybe both are true. I don't know.
Well, I don't think of myself as someone who has any sort of power over a society. So I do like to keep what the problem is. Like I recognize that the problem is, yes, I don't think that this arrangement is necessarily panning out well. At the same time, we're all in it. And so I think that pointing out a problem without offering a solution is somewhat abusive. So I have plenty of practical information about, okay, so how do we then be productive while still needing to be in front of a computer? And so, yes, I mean, I have whole books that are just on how to create a dynamic work situation when you are within a workspace that you can't leave. So I always just try to really consider, everyone in my family is not going anywhere really from their life. So how do we get more movement within the context of our life without a major overhaul, which just really isn't feasible for most people? So I am supportive of definitely the standing workstation, except I like to point out that one of the reasons we migrated to desks was because standing all day comes with its own set of ailments. Like we've already had that experiment of people who have to work and stand all the time, and sedentarism, sitting or standing, isn't great. So I'm more for a dynamic workstation to understand, to learn the principles of physiology and movement so that you can figure out how to kind of flow between a few different movements within your current workspace. That's my solution. We can get into more solutions specifically if you like, but to that point, I think that we do not have to take our productive time that is in an office in front of a computer and be so sedentary with it. I think there's a abundant movement to be found without us needing to leave our workspace or decrease productivity. In fact, I think you'd actually see an increase in productivity by following some of my suggestions.
So what are some basics? So let's just take my life, for example. So I move from a standing desk where I prepare to see patients, and I spend, between 5 and 20 minutes, sometimes a little bit longer, but typically between 5 and 20 minutes preparing to see somebody. I go into an office, a doctor's office, and I sit down and I talk to them anywhere between 25 and over an hour, where I'm primarily sitting. Of course, I get up to do an exam, but, how can I do better? And I know I'm like everybody else. So I'm either sitting or at a standing desk. So that's pretty much everybody that works in an office setting, right? How do we do better given that framework?
Well, I think that doing better comes back to maybe your first question, which is like, what's the difference between exercise and movement? And I think that there's so much more to movement than exercise. For example, the way people get dressed every single day. Most things that people put on their body are already limiting the mobility of certain tissues and maybe even certain functions within their body. So like my basic recommendations are, when you get up in the morning and go to your closet, does the jacket that you put on your body not even allow your arms overhead? Or do you have a belt on there all day long that's increasing or changing your intra-abdominal pressure? Do you have, a 1 to 2 inch heel on the back of your shoe? Or do your shoes push the forefoot together? Meaning that as you are walking from one place to another in your otherwise, sedentary day, wondering about how to get more movement, your clothing could actually be allowing more movement for that same period of time. And then the next piece is to look at, okay, well, what's the shape of my body when I'm working? So at your standing workstation, it's one shape. If you're at a sitting desk, it's another shape. So then the second piece there is to be like, okay, for those two tasks, sitting in your chair and standing at your workstation, can you vary your shape while you are still there? So we tend to be we fall into repetitive positioning very well because conserving energy is kind of our default. So I teach people how to sit differently within their same seat so that they can, so like if you came to physiotherapy and you were talking about your SI joint issue or your piriformis issue, and I gave you a stretch of crossing, one leg over so that you would rotate your hip in a particular way, and you're in therapy and you're doing your stretch, or you take a yoga class and you're doing a stretch, but you can do that exact same move while you're sitting at your desk. It doesn't require a movement office, a fitness scenario, a therapy scenario to be effective on the cellular level. It's only that you do that movement. So I have people cycle through various movements while they're in their chair and still being productive, and they can change once every 4 minutes. It doesn't have to look like a workout sitting in your chair, but you're doing 6 hours of exactly the same motion. So breaking it up is a very easy way to take the pressure off certain parts of your body and add loads to places that are kind of sedentary within your body. And then as you move to another, your office or where you're seeing people clinically, that too has a shape. And so I have phlebotomists who will say the same thing, like I'm trying to figure out how do I make over, like, this is the way I bend over in this way to draw blood. And then we'll go over, okay, well, we're going to create a squat protocol for you so that you can be down on the patient level and still do your task, but not use your body in exactly the same way to do it. So it's kind of an ergonomic perspective to create various ways of doing it. So thus you end up moving more of your body for the same tasks. So in general, that's how I approach it.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. When we moved into our new offices, winter of 2016, I believe it was, we got all types of training, and we were in the first office area, I think the second in the country or something, that had this well building criteria, which goes beyond green. It's lighting and natural light and which type of indoor light and quality of water. And it just goes on and on, VOC, volatile organic compound, vapors, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought one of the most useful trainings that we had, of the 2 days or so of training that we had on how to sort of live and be in this space, was on kind of the ergonomics of the desks and the chairs. We had these really fancy chairs, and it was like a half an hour class on how to use the chairs. And I have found it's really helped my back and sort of my arms, and it's been really, really helpful. But you, Katy, are going way beyond that, because what you're describing, what I'm hearing at least, is sort of this idea of varying your shapes and adding loads. So I get the varying the shapes. When you say adding loads to the body, can you explain a little bit more what you mean mechanistically by adding loads?
Oh, well,
okay. Well,
it's the easiest way to explain it.
No pun intended, I guess.
Exactly. So you have a shape with your body, but that shape is one particular load, and then there is actually using it. So if you are to sit in a chair, and you can kind of think of, like, I always think everything in terms of like a constellation. So if you're to look at yourself from the side, and you're in this shape of your ankles are around 90 degrees, and your knees and your hips are around 90 degrees, and that's a particular shape. But the load is pretty much the same. But I could take that chair out from you, and you would have the same geometrical shape, but now you would be using a lot more of your muscle to hold you there. Mm-hmm. So the load would be varying, even though the shape was the same. And so I think what happens is we are very shape centric right now, because it's easier to go, like, in ergonomics, it's a quick shape makeover, which is definitely helpful. It's just that we are so prone to sedentarism that we're often not adding a lot of work to our body. So you get some movement differences by changing shape, and you get further movement differences by changing load, meaning the work on the cellular level is different, because once you have muscles that are not just lengthening and shortening, but contracting, they expand radially, they're going to then create different pressures on the cells around them. And so load variance is just as important as shape variance. And so we just don't work very much with our body. So we are now recognizing the need to vary position, which is step one. And the reason I don't get super excited about it is because that's kind of like, we've known that need for 30 years. This is just how long it takes to trickle down into offices, where I think people have already moved on to loads, is to recognize, like, oh, like, you actually have to be moving and things have to be flowing in different ways. And so we need load variance as well as shape variance, which means we have to be picking things that are straining and stressing us probably a little bit more than what is happening and in our current day-to-day scenario.
So that's an interesting idea. So my wife is always moving things around, partly inspired by you, I have to say. I had to beg to get a couch in the room where we have a television. I'm a big sports fan. And we had it's like somebody's finally giving one away. We don't have to pay for it. So we got the couch from somebody else. You have some real clear thinking around the hazards of sitting and sort of making things more difficult. You just mentioned that, making things more difficult. Can you go into that a little bit more? Because I think some people are put off by that initially, but then when they learn what you mean by that, it makes a whole lot more sense.
Well, adding loads is such a nicer way than saying adding difficulty. So maybe I just use loads to say difficulty to remove the judgment. A load is a load, whether you like it or not, I don't care.
I studied physics.
The fact that it's a load or not, that's something that I can wrap my head around.
Yeah.
So when you work in health long enough, and when you work with people over the age of 50 long enough, you start to see that knees and hips are an area of the body that aren't living as long as the rest of the body that's surrounding them. And I learn very quickly, and I'm not really resistant to change. And, by the time you've seen your 10,000th person whose life is significantly altered by something in their knee or their hip not performing well, then it's like, okay, where do I have this repetitive geometry of my knees and my hips? Chairs is the environment. I mean, you go to school and you don't practice anything in school as much as you practice sitting. There's no other skill that you will practice as much as you do sitting. And then it's something that then persists with us for the rest of our life, where it is what we do, the people listening to this show, it's what they are going to do most often, despite a bunch of other activities. For the bulk of people, sitting will be the undercurrent of everything that they do in their life, which I found really profound. And when I was pregnant, all my graduate work is in female pelvic floor disorder. So I was very interested in just the shape of the pelvis and the workings of the hip and the pelvic floor. And when I was pregnant, really trying to look at the mechanics of that whole thing. And I said, you know what, I'm spending so much time doing, there's all these therapy things and mobility enhancing things. And I just felt like there's no way that one person who has to work and do all these other things could fit the 37 recommended exercises in to keep, their hips and their low back mobile. And if anyone's ever did physio or read a fitness magazine, if you have a few issues of those, the list of what you're supposed to do just gets longer every month. And so I couldn't spatially, I'm a physicist at heart, like there's a space-time continuum, like I can't fit it all in this 1 hour. So I said, I'm going to sit on the floor from now on. And it's not only the fact that my knees and my hips are in this particular position. It's like, now I have to take my 150 pounds. I'm going to have to use my own muscles to bring that in a slow, controlled way to the ground. And I'm going to have to bring it back up again, just like most of the people on the planet have to do every single day of their life, just not me, in one very outlying culture that is a furniture culture. Again, outliers for as far as humans go, this is an outlying kind of experiment. And so I just found by not even getting rid of my couch, just not sitting on it for a few months, that my physical robusticity was really great. And my husband, who is a semi-professional athlete, was busted by the time he was 31 or 32. Yeah. And we just started foregoing furniture. And we found that basically we were engaged in what would look like therapy outside, but it wasn't therapy. It was preventative, for the most part, because we didn't really have anything. We were just trying to stay strong and robust, and we didn't have to add any extra time. And you ended up doing something like 100 body weight squats, full range of motion. And then 10 years later, now we've gotten rid of furniture. We got rid of any device that it's like, oh, look, this is just something that everyone I know has, but it's not something that everyone in the world really has. And I just can use my body so much better when it's not there. So it's very akin, I would say, again, to go back to nutrition, like if a dietitian's trying to help you figure out how to lose weight or to decrease your blood sugar or whatever, they're not going to say, like, put ice cream in your freezer and just don't eat it. They're going to tell you not to buy it, right? Yeah. You're learning how to create an environment that's more supportive of your end goal. So that's all I did, is I just created an environment where moving is not an option. I don't have to create any willpower to do it. Like if I want to rest, I just sit on the floor and I move. I'm still taking rest. I'm still taking a seat, but it requires so much more movement. And in the end, so many therapies that we're doing now, and that's to go back to nutritious movement. A hallmark also for a nutrient is when you see therapies that emerge for replacing it. The therapies might look different than it in its natural state, but we're seeing lots of pressure therapies, of people being pushed on and foam rollered and things that are moving. And they use terms like, we're going to break up, this tissue or adhesions or, decrease the sensation to touch. But most of us sit on cushions. Like our whole life is cushioned and fluffy, and we've decreased actually cellular pressure head to toe. And so I just worked to put in that movement. I was like, oh, that natural movement throughout human history has involved a copious amount of pressure that your body, your cells deform. When you sit on a chair, you don't just sit on it like a rigid body. You know, your flesh is going to move and bend. And the firmer something is, the more pressure you've created, the more movement. And so I just looked at just how much pressure I had removed. It's like, okay, I sit on my fluffy couch to my fluffy car to my 3 feet of foam on my bed. Like I was like, look what I'm sleeping on. I found it so crazy. Not that I was doing that, but then I had to go figure out how to get an hour of therapy to roll out all my body tissues. And I was like, I can just do this by not getting those. And there you go.
So first of all, how old were you when you did that? And how long did it take your body to adapt to that? And then how long does it take, like an average, like a 50s, 60s, you know, somebody in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s?
Good questions. So I started my journey I started with my pillow. I was first pregnant when I was 35, and that's when I started sitting on my couch less. And I didn't have a couch 2 years later. But for those 2 years, I kind of just went between sitting on my couch. And then when I was like, I don't feel good, I would get off my couch and I would sit on the floor and I would lie on the floor and I would, do a little bit of stretching, and that pressure would kind of, people go to have parts moved around, manually pushed and pulled. Like that's just creating tension. Those are creating forces that happens naturally when you hang from things and lay out on things that are firm, that's how you create tensions naturally. So that was 2 years, like 35 through 37. But I really I had a lot of like neck. If I was going to have like one thing of my body that didn't feel well, it'd be constant headaches, where I was really taking, Tylenol for headaches weekly. And I had been given, different. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how much. For me, that's a lot because I don't really take anything else and have that. But that was a lot for me to be like, I have a headache once a week that I feel that is pretty disabling. And I didn't like that. Yeah. So I had been given, different neck stretches and neck alignment strengtheners. And I was like, and I'm always thinking more from an evolutionary perspective. And I was like, why am I doing this neck stretch? This just seems so weird that I have to do that. Okay, wait a minute. And then there was a paper that came out a while ago about world resting positions, sleeping positions, and then back pain prevalence in various cultures. And I was like, oh, right. Not everyone sleeps like in one repetitive position because pressure again, or the lack of, so it's like, if you take your body and you lay in clay, let's say really soft clay, or what's a better example? Those pin things, like where you can push your handprint through those things that have,
and leaves an impression.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So something really malleable like that. If I take my body position and I place myself down on that, the more malleable it is, the more the environment shifts to my shape and allows my shape to persist.
Yeah.
The less malleable something is, the more I have to move at the interface or in the interaction with the environment, the more I have to move. So I just really started to tune into basically all the casts. I call them casts in my work, which is things that allow you to have a repetitious shape, keeping in mind that the shape is on the tissue level, that you have tissue adaptations to that shape. So it's not just like your body shape can change. You've got mass distributions, bone, tendon, muscle, connective tissue level that match your most frequented position, because you adapt to what you do most often, not what you do with the best of intentions, unfortunately. Yeah. So I recognize that every night I put something underneath my head that would allow me 7 or 8 hours of this neck position that I was trying to stretch 20 minutes a day to get out of. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to ramp up the frequency of load. So, when you get braces on, mechano-transduction, orthodontics, even certain surgeries where they're putting various connectors in bone, they're trying to mechanically transduce a new shape. But the way that you do that is by creating high frequency of load. So if you've ever had braces on, they're putting a bracket on each tooth, but they're connecting each tooth to each other and then adding tension so that all those teeth move up to the jaw to signal the jaw which way to move. And that's all physiotherapy, and that's all exercise is as well. It's mechanically transducing a new shape. It's just that we do it so infrequently, you don't see great outcomes because we're trying to like change the shape of our body in 30 minutes 3 times a week or an hour a day. So it's just the frequency is so low, which is another reason I'm for movement. But anyway, I started going without this pillow, and it took me like 18 months. So now I can just sleep on a wood floor. And I do. We all sleep on the floor, and we have like a little cushion, or like I'll put down a sheep's wool and a sheet and our blanket, but we sleep on the floor. And so all night long, there is no repetitive shape. And so you wake up in the morning kind of in the same way that you wake up after many hours of a great pressure therapy situation. And so it took me 18 months to move away from a pillow. And it took me, I don't know, maybe like a year of, again, slowly transitioning. I have a transition plan to move out of your bed. I do not suggest that anyone just start sleeping on the ground, but to see how sensitive and adapted you are to your current bed, just try sleeping on the other side, which usually has a slightly different shape from your partner, or go into your guest bedroom, which has a slightly different tension. And then people wake up shattered the next day. And it's like, that's your physical robusticity right now. That's showing you that your ability to adapt is very low, that you don't have the malleability on a cellular level to really handle a very wide variance of pressure. I mean, you're just lying there, but it's a lot of hours. And so we go from there. It's like, just start sleeping on the other side or in a guest bedroom for a couple weeks. And then, there's a lot of other steps. But yeah, like, I think that I know that a lot of people have done it. There's been some magazines where the people have tried it and have written up, always trying to rush it. But I would say, give yourself a few years and start with just lying on the floor. Just start lying on the floor 10 minutes before bed. It's the same way that I approached getting rid of my couch, which is create some of that tension, traction, and pressure, but for a very short period of time, 10 minutes, and then just get into your regular bed. And you should notice yourself changing just from that small change of habit, and then you can increase it or adjust from there.
Do people experience sort of like pain, or there's some discomfort? In other words, if I'm used to sleeping in my sort of my mold bed, where it has the impression of my body on my side with my knees at a certain angle to my pelvis, it's going to certainly disrupt my sleep. So I might expect like a couple of week or two of disrupted sleep or pain. I mean, what do people go through when they start to work on these transitions? I mean, we're talking about some level of positive discomfort, correct?
Yeah, just like exercise. And I think that's the difference.
Yeah, sure.
If you exercise, we're just so used to the idea that you get sore from exercise that the understanding is like, oh, like this is adaptation. And the same goes for movement. The principles of the science aren't any different depending on what you call it. It's adaptation and tissue change. And certainly you can get pain. I think a lot of times people try to go too far. So, the general rule in exercise science is you make changes 10%, but like 10%, I don't know. How do you quantify 10% in terms of sleep, maybe time? So maybe you look at, okay, if I sleep for 8 hours, I'll take 10% of that in terms of minutes and just be on the floor for that amount and then get back up into the bed. So it's definitely, we tend to experience more sensation the less graduated the steps are that you break down the event to do. Like if you're trying to train for a half marathon or a 10K and you're like currently a couch potato, if you get up and like run 3 miles, you're going to feel so badly and as well as potentially do an injury that you're going to stop yourself from going any farther. So you definitely want to go stepwise. I have a lot of books and advice, and this is a very huge thing that I'm talking about, human movement. And so out of all the places to start with, I actually recommend that people start with their feet first, just for the reason that you are maybe alluding to, which is, when you lie on the floor or sleep on the floor, those are all of your joints that you're asking change all at once. And to move that many sedentary areas all at once, it's very large, I would say, to the parts of your brain that are monitoring change. But when we start with the feet, I have a very few simple tasks. And the thing is the same. Like we're going to decushion some of what you've got wrapped around your feet. You're going to start moving joints. You got 33 joints in each foot. And chances are you have actually had your feet encased every single day of your life in something that allowed a lot of muscles under the weight of all of your body to atrophy severely. So I just start with like the feet, because I found that there's very little negative sensation or issues. And then once you get a hang of that, then you're like, okay, now I understand what I'm doing. I'm basically doing what I just did to my foot, but to my whole body. And then people choose if they're just going to play with their workspace a little bit, or if they're going to sit on the couch and get in front of it and sit on the floor a few minutes each day. So there's so many different ways you can change how you move. I think it's best to pick what personally motivates you the most. And for most, that's like something that's bothering them right now, like an actual location of their body, and then build out from there. But I do recommend that everyone, they start moving in a very stepwise fashion, to make a pun.
So that's really good to know, is that you generally would recommend where people start from is their feet. And that's clearly laid out in the book, by the way, for those that haven't read the book. And the book is very comprehensive. It starts with foot, and it goes walking and sitting and lifting and carrying and, head position, rib position. And it's not the sort of like read it through for information. It struck me much more as a workbook. In fact, when I started doing the foot work at the beginning of the stretch, I was surprised that I was actually in quite a bit of pain initially. And I consider myself fairly athletic and in fairly good shape, and try to eat right for the most part. We try to practice what we are preaching. And it was a really interesting experience just to realize, wow, I'm now, of course, thinking about the way I'm sitting while I'm interviewing, and how, just like go to take inventory of your life. And I think, Katy, that's, at least from where I sit and what I do, part of the, I really think it's genius of what you're doing is that you've figured out a very clever, creative language. But when you talk about the way that you challenge the norms, when you draw these analogies and you say what you're saying, it's like obvious. That's, oh yeah, of course. Like, of course it would be like, and it's only this process of immobility cycle that you mentioned, and sedentarism, and all the things that you clearly have thought very deeply about for a long time, that really break these things down and kind of bring them home. I want to ask you about another thing. You mentioned injury. If somebody was just kind of a couch potato and all of a sudden ran 3 miles, they probably would be the last time they exercised for a long time, just because their body wasn't ready for it. And you also mentioned before that your initial background, I think, in education and training was female pelvic floor syndrome. And we discuss a lot on this show the role of stress, either acute and historic in the past, or chronic stressors and trauma, on how they have an impact on the brain, for sure, on memory, on the limbic system, et cetera. And I've heard you kind of touch on these ideas, but from a biomechanism standpoint, what do you think about the roles of stress and trauma on how we move, on immobility and things like that? Certainly, you probably have a lot to say, but have you noticed any big features, big points, themes that have come out of this?
Well, when people come to me, I would say that they haven't been moving for a long time. And they also have, I would say, a tremendous amount of stress. It's really hard to see what comes first. Are we stressed simply because we don't move? Or is sometimes a stress or a trauma so paralyzing either to a whole body or to tissues within the body that is part of their, like, a local sedentarism? So I definitely think that those are in play. They are kind of outside of the things that I think about what I do at great depth, but that's sometimes the problem of going deep, is you don't always cast a super wide net on so many of the things. The one thing that I'm interested in is movement as part of the, what's the best word? The metabolizing of stress hormone system. Mm-hmm. So, and I think of, like, again, traditional humans, hunter-gatherer humans, the idea of like an HPA axis, or like a stress, like a huge amount of stress hormone coinciding with a tremendous amount of physical motion. And so I'm very much interested in the relationship between the two. So there's a lot of systems in the body that are movement dependent, but we don't necessarily see them that way. So then now enter modern living, or at least modern living for you and I, where you can get a stress dump from reading an email, where so much of what's constantly generating stress is within a sedentary context. So I'm interested in how sedentarism influences kind of that stress, that physiological process of stress. Because of course, when we break it down, we're going to break it down. You're not going to be talking to kinesiologists or biomechanists necessarily about the role movement plays, because we really do have a force-free model of physiology right now. You're starting to see biophysics and physics come back in, but we don't really consider the role of movement on moving anything through our body, yet it is kind of the main force or input. So that would be, if I were, getting to ask questions about it, that would be what I would want to look at. And then the easiest way to probably take a look at it would be for looking at populations that are dealing with stress, diseases related to stress. How does exercise seem to impact symptoms for those populations? And that's how I would approach it, is kind of start working backwards to see, is there already evidence that movement for stress populations is a way of managing stress or decreasing measures of stress? That's how I would think about it.
That's really interesting. And you and I could probably spend 2 or 3 hours just talking about that by itself. You were last year on a panel, I believe it was Irvine, California, called Move for Minds, organized by Maria Shriver, that was somewhat focused on Alzheimer's, as I understand it. Can you tell us about the panel and that experience there last summer?
Yeah, Move for Minds is an organization. I don't know if it's Maria Shriver driven, but there's a women's Alzheimer's movement really looking at why the incidence of Alzheimer's is greater in women than in men. So that's that organization's main agenda. So this was a panel for that. Mm-hmm. And the panel was very interesting. I was brought in to talk about movement as well, because exercise really does seem to be, if anyone could start doing everything, that it really does appear that exercise is the thing to do. But of course, my 2 cents were, it really is time, given that exercise science is so much more robust than kind of these older understandings that get pulled up when non-movement people are using movement in their research, that there are some key findings in things like, I'm trying to think. So 2 things that I talked about is this idea that chewing, the act of mastication. Now, there's a human movement. There's a human movement that does not fall into the category of physical activity or exercise. So with the current definitions that we're using, it would be a non-movement. And so I just actually wrote a clarifying paper adding this into the terminology to say, we have to start recognizing movement as anything, any changes in position, because there's an abundant amount of cellular deformations that are not being considered when we talk about physical activity and exercise, as creating regional blood flow through the act of chewing. And so where does that fall on our understanding of what movement humans need? And when we're creating exercise prescriptions for people, chewing would probably go to oral motor therapist or a speech pathologist, but you're not going to see it.
Or like an oral myofunctional therapist or something like that.
Exactly. But you're not going to see it in this general fitness recommendations for people, because that's still make sure you ride your bike every day, do 20 minutes of cardio dancing. It's so oversimplified that there's key pieces of information of going, you need the muscles on your face. They have a role besides chewing your food. They're part of your oxygen distribution, nutrient distribution system. It's not optional to allow areas of your body to be sedentary. And in this day of the green smoothie, do we need to have chewing recommendations of do we have to say you need to, or do we have to create chewing therapies, which is get out your beef jerky and your, mangoes and make sure and that you're masticating 100, we are at the point where if it's not a recommendation, people aren't doing it. They don't see the value. That is the one side of evidence base is we're not giving everything that the evidence says. And
way too reductionist.
Yeah.
You're just completely out of the, like you were talking about at the beginning, it takes them very much out of the context of a normal life and just puts them in sort of the lab, which looks at 1 or 2 or 3 variables.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Which is great for the process, but it's not so great for the application. And then the other thing I talked about on the panel is a lot of cerebral blood flow is coming from foot strike. That your foot hitting the ground at a certain rate when you're walking is part of the upward mechanism of blood. And so what happens? Like, what would you expect to see in a population that doesn't move or really chew, given kind of overprocessed foods? And, like we're trying to, as people have curved spines and other things that relate to large amounts of chairs, and we try to make our foods softer so they don't get caught. And then now we've got atrophied jaw muscles. And so the idea of going, movement is so nuanced that if we're going that part of like the brain's blood distribution system is dependent on foot strike, then what does that mean for cycling? What does that mean for swimmers? Do we have to then make more robust physical recommendations, or simply should we just be researching using a more nuanced model of exercise? So that's what I'm interested in, is very complex models, because I think that's where the answers are going to be.
I couldn't agree with you more. And that's what we are busy trying to raise money to do. Katy, it's a pleasure and it's so refreshing to speak with you. I really think you are an original thinker. I hope that your message is being spread far and wide. I know it is already, and I'm sort of later to come to the party. But thank you so much for being here with us. What's the best way for people to, A, learn about you, and B, if they want to do some training with you, what are the options?
Nutritiousmovement.com really has everything. You can read. There's so much there. It doesn't matter if you're a auditory learner, you can listen to recordings if you're a reader. I've got 8 books. If you're a clinician and this is new to you, I would suggest with reading Move Your DNA first. Dynamic Aging is certainly a great practical book for a population of wanting to start adjusting their movement practice. But for clinicians wanting to understand really this nuance, then Move Your DNA is probably the best place to start. But yeah, that's a good place to find me.
Thank you so much for being with us, Katy.
Thanks, Nate.
So that's our episode. I hope you guys got something out of that. Check the show notes out on iTunes or on our website, where we've summarized the key points. If you have questions or comments or just want to connect, please check us out on our Facebook page. Or if you're old-fashioned like me, Google Evolving Past Alzheimer's Podcast, and you'll find us that way. Finally, if you find the information here valuable, please consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes and leaving comments in the comments section. It will really help us bring this message to as many people as we can. Thanks, and talk to you next time.